All right, welcome to our presentation today. We have the third in our four-part series with Andy Lau, and today we're going to talk about connection skills for team resilience. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Andy.
Thank you, Desiree. Yeah, so welcoming folk back, I just wanted to say as we begin that we have really been working in this four-session training on this idea of what we call the wildfire of secondary trauma. And we use that metaphor because we now know, because of the wisdom that comes from interpersonal neurobiology, that when we're exposed to high trauma and high threat in the work setting, that we don't just become overwhelmed or burned out because we're standing close to the intensity of our client situations or the intensity that comes from the broken systems that we often work in. But we actually now know through the wisdom of neuroscience that what happens is when we engage the traumatic material around us, the trauma that we're engaging actually breaks the brain-body barrier and actually rewires our own nervous system with a secondary traumatic impact. And so understanding how this wildfire impacts us and then how it can spread into team cultures and disfigure them and create isolation or high activation or disassociation. Um, and even the way that it can break the personal and professional boundary and begin to spread into our home settings. It's really key to be able to understand the dynamics of how this process works. And so we utilize these four theories: interpersonal neurobiology, embodiment theory, trauma theory, and attachment theory, blended together into um, a set of principles and ideas that can be applied directly into our own lives. But more importantly, because we're talking about connection today, like right into the vital connections that we have in our work settings. So, to remind you, we have this formula to describe how this process works. So, the red box, that basically indicates that trauma is always with us. We're not going to fix or solve trauma, even the trauma outside of us or the secondary trauma inside of us. What we have to have the courage to do is to engage it. That's why we have this plus sign in the formula. So this is more than a trauma-informed approach. This is a trauma-engaged approach because from a mammalian standpoint, mammals need each other. Human mammals need each other as we're hardwired for connection to be able to like make it through and be supported through some of the most difficult issues or elements of the impact of our works on our work on our own lives. So then we engage the trauma through acknowledgement, awareness, and we utilize these two skill sets: the awareness skills we looked at last time, which is learning how to use your thinking brain to track the cues in your embodied brain or your physiology where the trauma is moving into our systems at a very rapid rate. And then the second set of skills that we're going to be working with today are these connecting skills. Because as a mammal, connection is critical. And figuring out how to have effective connection in work cultures can really superpower the engagement of the secondary trauma, which can be in individuals, but also in the team culture, and then begin to move the culture or the individual towards this experience of what we call resilience. And resilience is synonymous with the idea of post-traumatic growth, right? It's that as we engage the trauma with the skills we're developing, we then develop resources that strengthen our whole human process. And so I'm excited to like really focus today more on the connecting aspect of the work that we do. So we all know that relationships are important, especially when we're doing human service work or any kind of engagement in mission-driven organizations, medicine, social work, education, frontline work. We all know that the use of our relationships is key and that relationships are part of what is necessary for mammals to thrive. But a lot of times we're not clear just what the specific purpose of relationships are. So we like to utilize the wisdom that comes from attachment theory to talk about the three forms of purpose for relationship. So the first one is to protect. Think about that vulnerable infant that you see in this image and how if this infant was left alone at birth, it would have no chance of survival. It needs to make effective contact with a supportive, protective environment. And then take a look at the image when you try to understand a little bit about what's involved in this issue of protection. For a second, look at the details of the image. Where do you see the evidence of protection? Notice the way she's holding the agrarian tool, that rake, in a kind of ready to go way to protect if there's threat. Or notice the way her hand brings the cradle board close, like proximity can create protection. And then I love her stance, and then her shoulders, and then that eye gaze. There's so many elements here that speak about the mammalian need for protection. The second purpose of relationship and attachment theory is nurturance, to be nurtured. So do that same kind of careful scanning of this image. Where do you see evidence of nurturance? I mean, we see that feeding itself, right? The actual sharing of food and resources. But then notice how there's this connection eye to eye, how the father's eye and the infant's eye meet. And then there's this emotional nourishment that's happening. And then the third evidence in here, in terms of nurturance, is notice the quality of physical contact these two are making. So the father is cradling the child, and there's this close sense of width. And then that touch, like that engagement of the finger, signals that nurturance is not just a one-way thing. It's not like we just nurture another um, infant or another person, but that nurturance has a co-regulative or collaborative or sharing process. Then the third reason that we need relationships as human mammals is the idea of regulate. Regulate. Now, this can be sometimes a more difficult concept to understand or comprehend. So take a look and just take a pause and look at the image. This is a like a 19th century painting of a mother and child. And be curious about what's happening here in terms of regulation. I mean, I like to ask myself when I see this image, is she tickling this kid or soothing them? Is the child on her lap or falling off of her lap, right? So, one thing we know for sure is that regulate doesn't just mean calm it down. Like, I think that's a misnomer in a lot of our understandings of regulation. What regulation actually means in this relational sense is that the mother, this figure of support, shows evidence in the image of being very deeply regulated herself. Like, notice how she's sitting on the earth and her feet are bare, and then this black skirt, it all signals connectedness and regulation. And then her own self regulation, perhaps using many of the skills that we talked about in our last training, that those awareness skills, are allowing her to reach toward the dynamic engagement of the child and like move with the child. So, a lot of regulation is actually a very dynamic process of both self regulating and engaging the intensity or the experience of those around us and creating a co regulatory match. So all of these three principles are key for mammals in all of our important relationships. These aren't just about our earliest relationships with parent and child. But protect, nurture, and regulate, it's like they're the key functions that mammals seek to be able to function optimally. So let's talk a little bit about these three elements in the context of a work setting, because work settings are actually very specific kinds of cultural groupings, right? We spend a bulk of our time in our work relationships, sometimes up to 8 or more hours a day. Um, we can develop personal connections at work. Um, Other relationships are more hierarchical or, remote in terms of dynamic engagement. But one of the things that's key is we know that it's important to bring these attachment skills and appropriately bring them in to effective skills and strategies that can help make the work environment a connection positive environment. So think about this kind of dynamic engagement in the work culture. Like if you look at this image, it talks about making dynamic connection at work. What's the sense you get from the image of the kind of dynamism that might be happening here? I mean, really, no dynamism. I mean, we've got like potentially a white guy with, in this case, it looks like a doctor because he has a stethoscope, but he's kind of faceless, pontificating. And then everyone's just kind of listening. And we know nothing about the quality of emotional engagement or dynamic engagement in the work setting. And some work cultures work like this. Then other work cultures work more like this. The boss or the leader or the hierarchy comes in, and then everyone goes into high arousal. So it's like fear based systems that create dynamism, is one form of work culture. And then other work cultures can read like this, right? We're all together, we're working collaboratively in kind of a group or circle process. But look at the cues in this about where people are actually at in terms of their presence in their bodies or their presence or connecting with each other. In some ways, you could say this is an image of a disassociated work system. And I know probably many of you have been either in many of these kinds of systems that we've described. But the goal that we're working towards in terms of bringing connecting skills into the work environment is to create much more dynamic, responsive connections, worker to worker, and then worker to team, so that we actually develop a very dynamic, regulatory, engaged, responsive work setting. And I love this image of connection because, like, as we learned last time when we were talking about our awareness skills, is that dynamic connection doesn't just happen thinking brain to thinking brain. And it's not all about emotion to emotion. In fact, I think one of the barriers to effective mammalian connection in work settings is lots of times people feel like they have to hold back appropriately, maybe, their emotional presence at work because that feels like something that should be happening in the therapist's office or in their home settings or with friend groups. But what this image indicates, like we learned last time, is that connection can happen at that 1/100th of a second from the embodied brain, person to person, in really dynamic ways that don't avoid cognition and thinking or emotion, but ground it more in the dynamic, embodied ways that we now know um, mammals need to function optimally as they connect. So there's like this barrier often when we're trying to create connection. There are like barriers of appropriateness. Is it appropriate to be this connected? Or our own defense systems about wanting to be safe and not be seen as vulnerable in work settings for fear of censure or judgment. But what we like to do in our work is to boil down or condense the essential aspects that are present in mammalian connection to begin to introduce those into our engagement processes at work. And so the things that really mammals need at the deepest level to be felt and engaged is what we call mirroring. Mirroring. Okay, so this is kind of a playful image of mirroring from the old I Love Lucy shows. But I actually like to use the image of mirroring that comes from those early attachment videos when you see a mother or parent and an infant connecting for the first time in the first few hours of life. If you watch these videos that are, they're used as research videos for developing more expertise with attachment work. So they actually film the mother and the child in what they call a split screen to see their responses in these early moments of connection. And what you see is a mammal comes into the world seeking connection. Because if they don't connect, there's not going to be safety, there won't be the provision of food or emotional support, and the infant would die. So the infant is making like all these dynamic, the infant can't use its cognition. That part of the brain hasn't been built yet. So they can't be like, hey, mom, I need X. And it's very hard. There's no like emotional development at that level of sophistication. But what is dynamically present in those earliest parts of our most primitive experience is the dynamism of movement. And so, what you see in these videos is a kid starts to show their need for connection by moving their head in a certain way, with having those engaging eyes, by sounding a sound of distress. And what you see in effective parenting, which happens naturally in about 75% of the population, is an attuned parent starts to become like the infant, right? They move their head that way, they mirror the sounds, they use their eyes to create dynamic connection. And then it happens in every video. If the infant can feel felt by the mirroring quality of that maternal presence, they make this sense of connection. And that connection is the first building block of all that's going to happen to build the capacity of that human. So we like to build these mirroring qualities and then these resonating qualities deep into the way that teams work. So an example of this would be we're talking about simple strategies that activate these two skill sets in our work culture. So I know in our first training, we talked about our arrival activity and how we do two steps that are about self-regulation or awareness by tracking our bodies and tracking the information in the room through our senses. But the second two skills we teach in arrival are infused with this idea of mirroring and resonating. So what we ask people to do in the third and fourth step of arrival, generally in a circle or in some kind of engagement process, is first just to make eye contact so that people can be seen, to be acknowledged, even without word. And then the second step is we have people say one word and sometimes a movement that expresses where they are in that moment as we begin a meeting or begin some work inside of the organization. But then importantly, we encourage the rest of the team to mirror back the word and the movement. Now, sometimes we get resistance to this because it seems like an odd thing to do at work. But one of the things we notice that once people start to feel the mammalian dynamism of that limited check-in, one word and engagement, one word and engagement, there starts to create a reverberatory regulatory process in the team culture that allows people to feel felt, right? That's really the thing that creates the framework for these connecting skills inside of organizations. It's that we take the risk not to solve everyone's dilemma or feel like we have to hold everyone's developmental trauma or emotional states. I mean, much of that does belong in more professionalized relationships, but it's this idea that each time I'm able to be genuinely present, that I will be genuinely met. And developing that skill inside of a group or a team process creates a real powerful superpower of helping people move with whatever traumatic states they're dealing with in their own systems, the secondary trauma, and begin the process of not just bringing resilience to them individually, but actually be beginning to create these connections that actually bring power and connection to the whole group. That's our goal. So let's think about some of the things that happen in terms of secondary trauma that we need these dynamic connections at work for. So we talk about in our work that there are four forms of secondary trauma. It's acute distress, um, vicarious trauma, moral injury, and burnout. So we're going to go through each of these and describe this unique aspects of each of these forms of secondary trauma, and then begin to think about the dynamic use of these connecting skills, this ability to feel felt deep in the core of our work systems. So this first form of secondary trauma, which is called acute distress, these are large single incident events that happen very dramatically and are highly disruptive to people's sense of stability in the work culture and can create high levels of distress. So think about things like the suicide of a client or the dealing with any kind of like sexual assault or other kinds of um, issues that have a high traumatic charge. Like these are what we call big T traumas. They intrude upon the system and they create this disruption that has to be acknowledged. And then this big T trauma, the acute distress, is contrasted with what we call little t trauma. And little t trauma, these are Bessel van der Kolk's concepts, is that chronic abuse and neglect that happens throughout many of populations that I've worked with through the years, so that a client's whole process of growth is characterized by abusive and neglectful processes. And like when we think about big T and little t trauma, one thing to always ask is which of them is more damaging? And generally, the response, the actual correct response, is little t trauma. Because little t trauma happens over time as the brain is growing and the being is growing. And that non responsiveness or that abuse creates like the hardware in the brain that actually becomes impacted by the trauma at a very deep level. Big T traumas, even though they have a high intensity, if we respond to them close to the proximity of the event with like debriefing or engagement or team connection, these can more easily be resolved. Um, One thing I want to also say though is like in a lot of cultures, like when there's a lot of little t trauma, there often are a lot of cofactors where big T trauma is present, like lots of big T trauma. Um, and then the other thing is, if you're dealing with big T trauma, it's always important to be aware of how people might have histories of little t trauma that are going to deeply impact how that big T trauma might impact them in an overall way. Like an example of this from my work came when the Mandalay Bay shooting happened in Las Vegas. And there were 60 Missoulians there all at the same time together. And I was part of the debriefing team that began to work with them about 3 to 4 days after the incident. And as we moved into this debriefing process and we were able to create this dynamic sense of connection and regulation in the group setting, as people began to not just share, but be met, the debriefing had this quality of connection, which allowed the intensity of this horrific event to be lifted to some degree out of these people's experiences. But we've tracked these people over time, and some of those folks who have little t trauma, um, in addition to this big T event, have needed much more subtle and ongoing work to move through the power of that event. So when we talk about the dynamism of a work culture, what we need to be willing to do is to show up in terms of dynamic presence when these big T events have happen. So the second form of secondary trauma is what we call vicarious trauma. And this is trauma that happens because of our close proximity to the people that we are working with. Like in this image, it's hard to tell like who's the professional and who's the client because exposure, the secondary trauma exposure can come across developmental trauma tree. We might have dilemmas where people will have specific activation charges or points that that where their own internal experience is triggered by the experience of their clients. And so in these situations, we need to have a dynamic web of relational connection in the work setting so that we can support others who are caught in this vicarious traumatic web, not to end it, but to regulate, to protect, to nurture. Now, the third form of secondary trauma is what we call moral injury. Moral injury can be harder to kind of conceptualize, but basically, what moral injury is anytime you're working in a situation where you're asked to do things as part of your regular work code or process that is counter to your own moral values, your own moral values. So, this might be, for example, we work with some hospice nurses who um, had the exact amount of medication necessary to help people have a relatively painless death. But oftentimes they were delivering these services, for example, in our Catholic hospital that had a lot of rules and regulations around how that medication can be approved and delivered. So there were oftentimes that these nurses would be in situations where they had the remedy to help someone die a painful death, less painful death, but not have the capacity to actually deliver the medication. So the moral injuries, or we also had a contract with sanitation department in Multnomah County, and these sanitation workers were tasked with cleaning out homelessness camps. So one of the things that was difficult is like we're hardwired as mammals to protect, regulate, and nurture. And these workers were actually asked as part of their work task to disrupt the safety and protection of many of the people living as unhoused people. So, when it comes to moral injury, it's important to engage others dynamically in these two ways. First, we should always be able to legitimate when people are dealing with morally difficult dilemmas. So that might mean um, legitimating that a lot of these dilemmas come from administrative policies or structures, and then do whatever we can as colleagues and supporters to actually help people create solutions around these dilemmas. Like in the example I gave with the nurses, we were able to encourage both team leadership teams from the two settings to work things out administratively. So there were less of these moments when people were caught in these terrifying, traumatizing moral dilemmas. So utilizing creative problem solving and engagement and support, listening to people as they hold the pain of moral injury, is really effective use of our connecting skills as we engage our organizations. Now, the fourth form of secondary trauma is what we call burnout. Now, we tend to think about burnout. This term is used more colloquially, and there's lots of different ways of understanding what it actually is. But one of the big misnomers of the use of the term burnout is that it's just isolated to individuals, because many of the things that create burnout are actually things that are felt throughout the work culture. So all teams can actually experience the power of this burnout. So I like to use this four-stage theory to talk about how burnout works and how it manifests in the work culture. So the first stage of burnout is just physical and emotional overwhelm. It's like you're going too fast, the drive energy is too intense, and you can't sustain it. So you just begin to collapse energetically. And if we had that protective or nurturing or regulating sense inside of our team systems and cultures or with our colleagues, we would be able to intervene there. But oftentimes, what happens is we actually encourage the drive because of the high needs in the situations we're working in. And then people collapse down to that second level of secondary trauma, which is called shame and doubt. So you know you're not doing an optimal job. You doubt the effectiveness of the work you're doing, and then you kind of hold it inside as this sort of dirty little shame secret. Like you don't want to talk to others about it. You manage it inside, kind of on the down low. And then we know that any system or platform built on shame cannot persist. And then what happens is the entire system collapses down into what we call cynicism and callousness. And this is where we develop this big wound or bruise or barrier around ourselves to protect us from the shame and doubt. And we become cynical and callous. We start to blame the people we're working with for their dilemmas. We start to use toxic dark humor, and we sort of survive in this kind of burned out way. And as the wildfire spreads, this spreads out into the web of the work culture itself, not just impacting one individual, but also entire teams. So what we need to do with burnout express it to each other and to be met wherever we're in this stage theory. Because what we're trying to avoid is that level 4 of the failure, hopelessness, and collapse as workers. You never see it coming. People think they're in 1, 2, or 3, and suddenly they just collapse out of the work culture. And it might look like a mental illness collapse or an addictions dilemma or chronic physical dilemmas, chronic illnesses, um, tension, insomnia, depression, anxiety. But every time that level 4 collapse happens, it looks like this. So take a second and just look at this image of the scream to imagine what that impact of secondary trauma in terms of burnout is. When we use this in our live trainings, we encourage people to look at the details of the image that actually create this sense of terror or chaos that comes from extreme forms of burnout. And one thing people always note is how the two figures at the left of the bridge are present but not engaged. There's a distance and a disconnect. And think about how, as mammals, we need that protect, nurture, and regulate. So the isolation itself is part of what happens that makes these forms of burnout or overwhelm most intense. Because people have trouble believing if they're not met with resonance and mirroring that sense of feel felt, that the vulnerability that they have is something to hide or to be ashamed of. And if we have optimal connecting cultures in the work setting, we start to understand that our vulnerability is really our courage to be seen and known. And I like to rely on, other forms of wisdom. And one of a real master of indigenous knowledge is Vin Deloria. He was an educator as well as a philosopher and a theologian and a native man. And I love this way that he describes the I love this way that he describes all of the ways in which uh, the modes of operating in terms of native culture are different in terms of the role of leadership itself. So he talks about in this slide about all of the ways in which we can look at leadership from an engaged position, the way we operate with elders. You know, that elders are these people inside of our culture that actually create many forms of vulnerable leadership. So he says, leadership in the traditional setting occurs by example and not as a process of indoctrination. That is to say, elders are the best living example of what the end product of education and life should be. Having trouble here moving my screen. Just 1 second. Hold on just a second. Just having some tech difficulty here with my thing. Hold on.
No problem. Thank you, Andy. We appreciate you.
Mm-hmm. Just going to pause for just a second, see if I can restart the share screen because I'm having trouble with that. There we go. We sometimes forget that life is exceedingly hard and that no one could accomplish everything that they could possibly do, or even many of the things that they intended to do. The elder exemplifies both the good and the bad experiences of life. And in witnessing their failures as much as their successes, we are cushioned in our despair of disappointment and bolstered in our exuberance of success. So, this is a really critical thing to think about in that as a leader or as a member of a team, being able to access our realness or our real mammalian presence is going to be really deeply encouraged as we have people who gather together to demonstrate their own comfort with their vulnerability as well as their strengths being met in that sense of feeling felt and being engaged. I also love this quote from Resmaa Menakem. He wrote, My Grandmother's Hands, which talks about trauma and secondary trauma in racialized cultures. And he says, when you gather together a large group of unsettled bodies or assemble a group of bodies and unsettle them, you get a mob or a riot. But having a large group of settled bodies together, and you have a potential movement and a potential force for tremendous good in the world. A calm, settled body, think about protect, nurture, and regulate, is the foundation for health, for healing, for helping, and for changing the world. So it's very key, as we can see, that we develop these awarenesses of how to create this dynamic connection in the work setting. But another key concept that we really think is important to round out the power of our understandings when it comes to the power of connection is to understand really deeply what connection is really comprised of. So we know it's about this mirroring and resonance that can help create this sense of feeling felt. But we also need to remember that healthy connection is always a blend, like a 50-50 blend of both engagement and boundary, of like connection and disconnection. And so if you take a look at this pie chart, you can see that this is a way that our curriculum has been changing or transforming. Because you can see how our original formula has the trauma plus the awareness and connection equals resilience. But here we've added these two other categories into connection. And we access these aspects, these dual aspects of connection, the engaging part and then the disengaging part, through tracking and awareness. So we're going to talk about how we track this skill and implement it in new ways. But let me elaborate a little more on the attachment videos and that split screen quality that makes it evident that healthy connection is this 50-50 between engagement and boundary. So after that infant has made its initial connection, the next thing you see on the videos is that the infant turns away. It's like so intense and so amazing and so intensely gratifying that in order to regulate it, the infant has to disconnect. And that disconnection usually happens for about 4.5 seconds. And then the infant turns back. And if the infant turns back and the mother or the parent is predictable, responsive, engaging, mirroring, and resonant, there's a secondary form of relief. And then 4.5 seconds later, the infant turns away again and then turns back. So it's this engagement between connection and disconnection that has to happen millions of times over the course of a human's development that actually helps to create an effective, whole, secure human. But the thing of it is oftentimes, even though we know this wisdom of engagement and boundary, in our deepest selves, when we get into our work cultures, oftentimes we just let go of the idea of boundary or disengagement altogether. I mean, we do 55 minutes of work with the client and then 5 minutes for ourselves. So instead of there being this like 50-50, 50-50 that would create sustainability, many systems require a high level of over-engagement, demand, drive, into the red, and then don't have this capacity to like see the value or the purpose of the boundary or the disengagement. So we like to come at boundaries in our work in several ways. And it's a big part of the curriculum that we utilize now because we understand how much dynamic and conscious boundary actually informs healthy systemic connecting and relational engagement. So take a look at this image of what we call horizontal boundaries. Horizontal boundaries, think about the flat surface of like a playing field that defines the work you do. Or in this situation, it's China with the Great Wall laying out as a boundary across the landscape. These are horizontal boundaries that define what's allowable and not allowable, what can be done and can't be done, like in the work setting. These are the kinds of things that you're going to hear like in an HR orientation. Like, for example, if you work with young clients, that many organizations don't allow the clients to be put in your personal car, or the idea that you can't have dual relationships with your clients if you're engaged with them in therapeutic or supportive processes. These are kind of the rules of the road, and these are what we think of as boundaries. The problem is, oftentimes the boundaries, the horizontal boundaries of our work settings, even though they're key and important for protection, they oftentimes don't acknowledge the deeper mammalian urge to connect. Like I know in my therapy practice through the years that it wasn't all of my clients that I would have difficulty holding personal and professional boundaries with. It was always the clients who were in the most suffering. And that was because I grew up in a preacher's family where there were no personal and professional boundaries. The people in my father's congregation were the people that were at my dinner table. And usually it was the people that were hurting the most that were held closest to our hearts and our family system. So, this idea of like the boundary for those who are most suffering didn't really, this horizontal boundary didn't really frame or create a way that felt coherent to my own development. Um, so, what we've shifted to in terms of tracking the power of boundary in the STAR-T model is to bring awareness in. So remember that awareness skills, and to bring awareness in, to develop awareness about how I can access what my own body is needing as I engage my work on a much more dynamic, in a much more dynamic way. So, not that we discount the horizontal boundary, but within that, workers are challenged to track what kind of proximity do they want with their client. Is it okay to move back or move towards in terms of physical proximity and boundary? Um, if you're working with folks, can you disengage or do you feel drawn into engagement? So, really tracking that in each individual interaction more as a physiological cue of where you want to be. And we call that skill that people can develop pulsing. Pulsing. And what we mean by pulsing, it's this pulsing between engagement and disengagement, connection and disconnection. And when we're practicing this as a dynamic felt skill, we're able to access it even if we stay present in the interaction with our clients or colleagues. So, for example, I could do a 55-minute therapy session and stay present to my client, but I could use the cues in my own body to track where I am in my activation system, utilizing the management of that through the window of tolerance, like we talked about in our second session, to be able to both be with the client, but momentarily return back into the boundary of my own being to check in about my own regulatory process. Many times I don't even have to make that evident to the client. I just can move in and then come back into connection with them. What I noticed with the practice of these skills is now I'm able to do that just about 7 or 8 times each hour so that I'm with the client and then I'm with myself. I'm with the client and then I'm with myself. So, to create this sense of the sustaining engagement, we need dynamic, healthy, powerful boundaries. The other thing that's key is to develop an awareness of the unique nature of each person's personal boundary system. So, for example, the being able to begin to reflect how each person's use of that dynamic, more visceral vertical boundary is impacted by their personality style, their strategies, all kinds of things that make them the real presence person that they are. And so, you know, as we talked about in our second session about how each person has a unique nervous system that works in unique ways, each person has their unique way of engagement and boundary in their life and work setting. So we do a number of activities that help people be curious about their boundaries and actually to begin the process of creating and building them so they're able to function with them more effectively. Now, this image is interesting. It came from some boundary work we did during the days of COVID when we were all working online. And what we did is we asked people in their home settings to think about how their boundaries work. You know, are they rigid? Are they porous? How do people get access to them? Who gets in closest? Who gets far away? We would have people draw images of it. And I'll also take items in their natural environment to actually construct the boundaries. So this was one of the images that we got back that we utilized during the training. And this comes from actually one of the clinical directors of the YWCA in Missoula. And she basically created this beautiful boundary out of her Christmas lights. She had it all laid out. And as she described it to us, she said, you know, I was really getting excited to discover how my own boundaries worked. Like I felt secure inside this circle of lights that I had made. I felt like the lights were illuminating me and illuminating my clients because they created that healthy sense of boundary. And then she said, when she took her camera to take an image of the boundary to send it to us, her dog burst through the circle of lights, and then she said in the training, sometimes I wonder if I have any personal boundary at all when it comes to my animals. So just to begin to be curious and aware and playful about how we look at the understanding of our personal boundaries and then the sharing of those in our work settings. So, in summary, like really what we're seeking to do is to create processes of dynamic engagement through these skills of mirroring and resonance and allowing people to feel felt. You know, it's interesting. We used to say in our training process that the goal of healthy relationship or dynamic connection skills in the work setting was to create environments of safety. And what we're talking about is that sense of attachment, security, or safety when people feel met, when people take the risk to engage, and then they feel met and responded to, and it gives them the courage to grow and be from the position that they engage. But then, as we began to do our work in other kinds of cultures, like in cultures where there were more Black and Brown people, BIPOC cultures, diverse cultures, one of the things we began to hear and learn about is that the word safe doesn't really apply for many of those cultures because of the high degrees of generational trauma that are present in their experience of living and working in our Western culture with its racism and patriarchy and absence of focus on diversity. So we struggled with that. And then we came to this new awareness that what we're actually creating with these connection skills are what we call brave spaces. So we want to create these brave spaces inside of our work culture where people have the risks to engage both their strengths and their vulnerabilities. So there's a bravery in engagement and then a bravery and responsiveness so that mirroring someone's check-in word or resonating with someone's experience and being content that that resonation is resonance is the thing that I as another mammal am required to give to others who connect with me. Those simple processes are what begin to superpower that idea of connection in the work setting and to actually create this space of bravery that gives us the courage to really track all of these forms of secondary trauma that can be so difficult, traumatizing, and overwhelming. So, wonder as we're like moving through this, if just wanted to keep a little space for questions. So I wonder, is there any questions that have come up given this material that anyone would like to describe or work with? Questions?
I just want to say that my experience with pulsing, I notice um, that connection engagement, not just with professional, like client provider boundaries, but also with personal relationships and uh, when I'm feeling activated and my boundary feels diminished, I have a tendency to want to overextend to please and appease. And I've been able to notice that in my system and then pulse back to checking in with myself to see what it is I really need in that moment rather than like appeasing the thing that's activating me.
Yeah, it's interesting, Lydia. It's almost like if we just go with the demand of the work culture or the environment, we're going to get pulled off our boundary and like into the demand. But you're saying you're using with awareness the subtlety of the cues in your own physical system to track, do I need to come subtly back into myself or move back into engagement? So like you are the source where the engagement and the boundary is being modulated from. Is that
Yes,
yeah?
exactly.
And
That's
like
correct.
Lydia, when you're able to do that, what's the outcome for you? What do you observe the outcome is rather than kind of being pulled over your skis into the situation's demand?
Right, right. What I notice when I'm not pulsing is that leaning into the overextension, which can be overwhelming, where you feel more tendencies of burnout. And when I'm noticing the awareness, um, it feels there's more of a sense of safety and reassurance
Hmm.
that comes in the system and in checking in with what I really need. And I also noticed as somebody with trauma on board is that when I'm activated, sometimes I need to take time to process and not answer in the moment. And that's that pulse.
Hmm.
Right. So if I'm feeling that like overextension, noticing it in my system, and then asking for time with something rather than uh, to react to it.
Got it. Got it. And then, like, just to build on what Lydia's describing, she's describing it as a kind of personal tracking process, and you have to develop this pulsing skill that way. But then think about in work environments that begin to build together around the wisdom of that process so that you notice your colleagues' need for connection and engagement, and then also notice their need for pulling back and pacing, because this is a way that we can then co-regulate ourselves as we're moving through the demands of our work process. Curious, anyone else? Any thoughts, comments, or questions? So I'll leave you with one last, like, sort of micro skill, right? So think about using condensed engagement or check-in, like the one-word check-in or the three-word check-in we use, and bring that to your work environment, right? So like instead of starting the day or the meeting with a big narrative check-in where you hear about like everyone's, you know, what happened over the weekend and the snowmobile accident and the kid's birthday cake and what Costco was like. It's like none of that often really gives us a lot of information about how people kind of like actually are in the moment and actually gives us an opportunity to meet them. So take the risk to start with like a limited check-in. Like let's all go around and just say one word, maybe a word in a movement that expresses something about you in this moment. But then take this second step of the risk, the brave risk to kind of engage and mirror that, either by repeating the word or repeating the motion. And as you move through that process and begin to build that into the core of your team responsiveness, that's going to bring a really dynamic, brave space like on board in the middle of your culture. And that's the kind of thing that is then going to give you the capacity to engage all of these forms of secondary trauma that are impacting us individually and collectively. So, thank you for connecting today, and looking forward to our next session that's coming up.
Thank you so much, Andy.
Mhm.
We'll see you at the next on the, what was the date? The 31st. Our fourth and final session will be on the 31st. So we hope to see you there.
See you then.
Thank you.
You,
Thank you.
Andy.
Bye bye. Thank you.